Panjshir Valley, Afghanistan. September 1984. Late afternoon. The sun hangs low, casting long, distorting shadows from the jagged Hindu Kush peaks. Dust, fine and pervasive, coats everything. The metallic grind of engines breaks the mountain silence. A Soviet motorized rifle column, a snake of green steel, winds along the valley floor. At its heart, 3 T-55 tanks. Their diesel exhaust smudges the clear air. Inside the lead tank, the air is thick with the smell of fuel, sweat, and hot metal. The commander scans the barren slopes through his binoculars. Nothing moves but the dust devils. Routine. Another slow, grinding patrol. A kilometer away on a rocky outcrop, the scene is still. 2 Mujahideen fighters lie prone. Between them, a long green tube rests on a bipod. One man peers through a powerful optical sight. His crosshairs settle on the lead T-55's turret. He exhales half a prayer. His finger depresses the trigger. There is no roaring launch. Only a soft thump, a burst of backblast kicking up dirt behind the rock. A slender projectile, almost graceful, arcs out. A thin wire, unseen, unspools behind it. For the Soviet tankers, the first sign is a tiny, unexpected star of light on the slope. Then a trail of smoke, snaking directly toward them with impossible, unwavering purpose. No arcing. No deviation. It is coming for them. The gunner inside sees it through his vision block. A second of frozen comprehension. A scream into the intercom is too late. The shape charge warlet meets armor. Physics takes over. A jet of superheated copper, moving at hypersonic speed, punches through the steel as if it were paper. Inside, the world becomes fire, molten metal, and overpressure. The turret, lifted by secondary explosions, slams back down with a final, terrible groan. On the slope, the wire is cut. The gunner is already moving, the launcher tube discarded. The valley echoes with the first unmistakable crack of a new era in warfare. An era where a man in rags with a box and a wire could dictate terms to a superpower's steel fist. The shockwave of that impact would ripple far beyond the Panjshir, into the very psyche of the Soviet war machine. To understand the profound shock of that moment in the Panjshir, one must first comprehend the absolute faith the Soviet Union placed in its armored forces. The invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 was, in many ways, a classic expression of Soviet operational art. It was built on speed, mass, and overwhelming firepower. The VDV, the airborne forces, seized key installations in Kabul. The 40th Army's columns, thousands of vehicles strong, crossed the Amu Darya River on pontoon bridges. At the spearhead of these columns were the tanks, primarily the T-55 and the newer T-62. These were not just machines, they were instruments of political will and military doctrine. The Soviet tank was a symbol of victory inherited from the Great Patriotic War. Its role in Afghanistan was perceived as straightforward: provide invincible mobile firepower, crush any conventional resistance, and project Soviet authority along the country's limited road network, the vital arteries of control. Initially, this doctrine appeared vindicated. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan's DRA own mutinous armor was swiftly neutralized. The Mujahideen, a fragmented constellation of guerrilla groups, had nothing that could seriously challenge a main battle tank. Their arsenal consisted of First World War-era rifles, a scattering of RPG-2s and RPG-7s and recoilless rifles. An RPG-7, in the hands of a skilled and courageous fighter, could disable a tank, but it required him to approach within 200 to 300 meters, a perilous sprint across open ground under a torrent of coaxial machine gun fire. The tank, inside its steel shell, felt like a fortress. The Soviet tank crew of the early 1980s, typically a young commander, a gunner, a loader, and a driver, operated with this sense of protected superiority. Their training emphasized offensive maneuver, combined arms operations with motorized infantry, BMPs, and artillery support. They were prepared for a European battlefield against NATO. Afghanistan presented a different geometry of war. The terrain was a crushing opponent in itself: narrow mountain passes, vertiginous switchbacks, and valley floors that became kill zones. The enemy was not a line on a map, but the very landscape and the people who melted into it. Yet for the first few years, Soviet armor remained dominant. Convoy escort, base defense, and direct fire support for infantry assaults. The tanks performed their duties. Ambushes were costly for the Mujahideen, who often sacrificed dozens of men for a chance to knock out a single vehicle with satchel charges or close assault RPGs. The psychological edge was with the tankers. They were the masters of the road, the giants whose passage could not be denied. This confidence, however, was built on a fragile premise: that the technological imbalance would remain absolute. That premise was being dismantled, not in Kabul or Moscow, but in distant Langley, Virginia and Rawalpindi, Pakistan. The war in Afghanistan was never a bilateral conflict. From its earliest days, it was a proxy struggle, a bloody chessboard of the Cold War. For the United States, the Soviet invasion was a strategic shock and a profound opportunity. President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, famously saw it as the Soviet Union's own Vietnam. The goal was explicit: to bleed the USSR to make the occupation unsustainable. This policy found its willing instrument in Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, ISI. Pakistan, under the military rule of General Zia-ul-Haq, viewed a Soviet-controlled Afghanistan as an existential threat, a potential Soviet client state on its vulnerable western border. The ISI became the conduit, the filter, and the manager for the vast flow of weapons and money destined for the Mujahideen. Initially, this aid was limited, almost symbolic: old British Lee Enfields, Egyptian small arms, and deniable quantities of ammunition. It was enough to sustain a resistance but not to transform it. The turning point came with the Reagan administration in 1981. Reagan and his Director of Central Intelligence, William J. Casey, escalated the covert program into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, codenamed Operation Cyclone. The doctrine shifted from merely harassing the Soviets to equipping the Mujahideen to actually win. This required a qualitative leap in weaponry. The question became, what single weapon system could most dramatically alter the tactical equation on Afghanistan's battlefields? The answer lay in the realm of anti-armor technology. Soviet armor was the backbone of their tactical mobility and psychological dominance. To break it would be to break the spine of the 40th Army's operations. The CIA's weapons analysts identified the perfect candidate: the BGM-71 tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missile, the TOW. Developed in the 1960s and proven in the latter stages of the Vietnam War, the TOW was a generation ahead of the RPG-7. It had an effective range of over 3,000 meters, far beyond the reach of a tank's machine guns or even the effective range of many Soviet supporting weapons. It required no heroic, suicidal dash. A two-man team could engage from a hidden ridge. Most crucially, it was precision-guided. Once the gunner placed his crosshairs on the target, the missile's flight computer, linked by two hair-thin wires unspooling behind it, would send correction signals, keeping the missile on track. For the gunner, it was a matter of keeping the sight centered. The missile, in effect, guided itself to the point of aim. By 1983-84, the decision was made. Thousands of TOW launchers and missiles began their clandestine journey. They were shipped to Pakistan, where ISI handlers integrated them into the logistics pipeline. Distribution was selective, favoring the more disciplined and effective commanders like Ahmed Shah Massoud in the Panjshir Valley. Training was rudimentary but effective, often conducted by ISI officers who themselves had been trained by CIA and U.S. Army Special Forces advisors in secret camps. The stage was now set. A 19th-century-style guerrilla force was about to be handed a weapon from the late 20th century's high-tech arsenal. Soviet tankers, cruising in their steel behemoths, were utterly unaware that the rules of their war were about to be rewritten from a remote laboratory in the United States. The first TOWs arrived in country, were unpacked in mountain caves, and their sighting scopes were turned toward the valley roads below. The era of the ambush was over. The era of the long-range precision kill had begun. This technological transfusion created not one but multiple interlocking realities on the battlefield. For the young conscripts and junior officers inside the T-55s and T-62s, the tank was a world of constant vibration, deafening noise, and claustrophobic heat. It was a collective organism of 4 men, their fates welded together inside 40 tons of steel. They developed a tactile intimacy with their machine: the greasy feel of the manual turret traverse wheel, the specific clang of a shell casing hitting the floor, the driver's muttered curses over the intercom as he navigated another impossible wadi. Their confidence was a hard-won thing, forged not in grand battles but in the daily grind of patrols where their presence alone often decided the outcome. They were the armored fist, and for years nothing in Afghanistan could break it. The psychological impact of the TOW missile was therefore cataclysmic. It violated every expectation of combat they possessed. Previous attacks followed a recognizable, if terrifying, pattern: the crack of gunfire, the whoosh of an RPG round that often sailed wide or struck a glancing blow, the frantic search for the origin of the smoke trail. There was a chaotic human element to it. The TOW introduced something alien: a silent, teleological strike. There was no warning whoosh from a nearby launcher. The first sign was often the missile itself in flight, seen through a vision block or periscope. Its smoke trail was not a curving arc but a straight, unerring line connecting the launch point to their own vehicle with geometric inevitability. The horror was in its guidance. To watch that line correct itself, to see it steady on a path directly for your vision slit or engine deck, was to experience a new kind of helplessness. In the 2 to 3 seconds of flight from a distant ridge, there was nothing to be done. Reactive maneuvers were useless. Returning fire was impossible. The launch point was often a tiny speck invisible to the naked eye. The tank's armor, their psychological shield, was now a predetermined tomb. Veterans of the war describe a unique, cold fear associated with the TOW, different from the adrenaline of a close-range ambush. It was the fear of being chosen, of being erased by an invisible, intelligent force. A crewman's sense of safety transformed into a constant, low-grade anxiety, a scanning of every distant ridgeline not for men, but for the telltale flash of a launch. The fortress had become a target. Prior to the TOW, the Mujahideen ambush was an act of immense courage and high cost. It relied on mass small arms fire to pin a convoy, while small teams of dedicated anti-tank fighters, often martyrs in their own minds, would scramble forward to use RPGs at point-blank range. Success was measured in the number of fighters lost versus vehicles destroyed. It was a brutal arithmetic that favored the Soviets. The introduction of the TOW rewrote the tactical playbook entirely. It enabled what military theorists call standoff engagement. A typical TOW ambush was a study in deliberate, clinical planning. Scouts would identify a frequented Soviet route, a mountain pass, a river crossing, a valley constriction. A firing position would be chosen not for cover to approach, but for optimal fields of fire at extreme range, often over 2,000 meters. The team, a gunner, a loader, and security elements, would infiltrate the position hours or even a day in advance. The system's tripod and sight were set up with painstaking care. The engagement was no longer an ambush of opportunity, it was a deliberate sniper operation against armored vehicles. When the Soviet column entered the kill zone, the sequence was devastatingly efficient. The priority target was no longer the lead truck, but the armor, the tanks or BMPs in the center of the column. The gunner would acquire, track, and fire. The backblast, a significant signature, was now a calculated risk taken from a distance where immediate retaliation was unlikely. The first tank would be hit, its burning hulk blocking the road. Chaos would ensue as the column compressed. The TOW team, if they had multiple missiles, would often engage a second vehicle, preferably the last in the line, to trap the remainder. Then they would disassemble the launcher, abandon the heavy tube, replacements were flowing in via CIA pipelines, and exfiltrate, often before Soviet mortars or helicopter gunships could vector in on their position. This shift transformed the Mujahideen from harassers into battlefield dominators in key engagements. Roads were no longer merely dangerous. They became linear shooting galleries where Soviet armor lost its freedom of maneuver. The psychological dominance of the tank was shattered not by mass, but by precision. The horror it inspired was born not in the heat of battle, but in the cool, precise environment of American weapons laboratories. The Hughes Aircraft Company's BGM-71 TOW, tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided, missile represented a paradigm shift in infantry anti-armor capability. Its genius was in its elegant, mechanical simplicity and reliability. The system was contained, a launch tube, a traversing unit, and a daylight optical sight. Its core technology was the twin-wire guidance system. Upon launch, the missile's small initial booster ejected it from the tube several meters before the main sustainer motor ignited. A soft launch that minimized backblast in confined spaces. As the missile flew, 2 hair-thin wires, enamel-coated and spooled from the base of the missile, unreeled behind it. The gunner's role was not to steer, but to simply keep the optical crosshairs centered on the target. An infrared tracker in the sight detected a beacon in the missile's tail. A computer in the ground unit compared the missile's position to the line of sight. Any deviation generated a correction signal, which was transmitted up the wires to the missile's control fins. It was a closed-loop system. The missile, in effect, flew itself down the gunner's line of sight. This SACLOS, semi-automatic command to line of sight, guidance made it remarkably accurate and largely immune to the gunner's nerves. In Afghanistan, the basic TOW model, with a 3.9 kg shaped charge warhead, could penetrate over 430 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, far exceeding the protection of any Soviet tank in theater, especially on the thinner side, and top armor typically presented in mountainous ambushes. Its effective range of 3,000 meters was transformational. It placed the gunner far beyond the effective range of a tank's main gun, about 1 to 2 kilometers for a moving target, and its coaxial machine gun. The system was not without vulnerabilities. The wire could be severed by terrain or vegetation, causing the missile to go rogue. The flight time to maximum range was nearly 20 seconds, giving observing crews a slim window to react, though often only with terror. The backblast was enormous, a 30-meter-long jet of superheated gas that instantly revealed the firing position to any observer. But in the vastness of the Afghan hills, with pre-planned escape routes, this was a managed risk. For the Soviets, the technology felt inhuman. There was no dodging a projectile that continuously corrected its course. It represented a form of battlefield automation where American engineering did the killing, with the Mujahideen as its lethal interface. The flow of TOW missiles into Afghanistan was the result of 3 distinct, converging strategic calculations. In Langley, under William Casey, the TOW was the centerpiece of a deliberate strategy to raise the cost of the Soviet occupation to unsustainable levels. It was a weapon chosen for its psychological impact as much as its destructive power. Casey and the CIA's Near East Division understood that decimating the invincible image of the Soviet tank would corrode morale and force a wholesale, resource-intensive change in tactics. They provided not just weapons, but the training syllabi and maintenance pipelines to ensure they were used effectively. In Islamabad, the ISI under General Akhtar Abdur Rahman saw the TOW as a force multiplier that could empower favored, more disciplined commanders like Massoud and Jalaluddin Haqqani. This served Pakistan's dual aims, bleeding the Soviets while shaping a post-war Afghanistan amenable to Pakistani influence. The ISI controlled the spigot, using the weapon to reward success and loyalty, thereby tightening their organizational grip on the resistance. The TOW became an instrument of patronage and control within the Mujahideen ecosystem. In Moscow, the Politburo and the General Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces initially viewed these losses as tactical anomalies, the price of a difficult counterinsurgency. But as TOW ambushes became routine in key sectors like the Panjshir, the Logar Valley, and around the strategic airbase at Bagram, a grim realization set in. Their technological edge had been matched, then overmatched in a critical domain. The strategic calculation they now faced was grim: commit massive resources to develop and field countermeasures, jammers, explosive reactive armor, new tactics, for a war they were increasingly losing politically, or accelerate withdrawal. The TOW, a single weapons system, helped tip this calculus. It made the preservation of armor, the symbol of Soviet power, prohibitively costly. It turned every road move into a potential catastrophe, constricting operational mobility and initiative. Thus, a tool conceived in a California lab became the pivot upon which the human experience of the tanker, the tactical choices of the guerrilla, and the strategic deliberations of superpowers all turned. The convergence of these angles created a new and devastating reality on the ground, a reality that would crystallize in a series of defining, brutal encounters. The years 1984 and 1985 marked the bloody zenith of the TOW missile's impact on the Soviet war in Afghanistan. It was no longer an experimental weapon or a rare trophy. It became a standardized, systematic component of the Mujahideen arsenal, flowing through the CISI pipeline in such numbers that skilled commanders could plan entire operations around its capabilities. This period saw the transition from shocking, isolated kills to the methodical dismantling of Soviet armored tactics. The Panjshir Valley, under the command of Ahmed Shah Massoud, became the primary proving ground. Massoud, a tactical genius with an acute understanding of technology, integrated the TOW into his defensive schemes perfectly. He established dedicated anti-armor teams, trained specifically on the system, and positioned them in mutually supporting, pre-surveyed hide sites along the valley's length. In the 5th Panjshir Offensive of May-June 1984, a massive Soviet operation involving over 15,000 troops aimed at finally crushing Massoud, the TOW's role was decisive. As Soviet armored columns, supported by heliborne air assaults, pushed into the valley, they were met not with massed infantry, but with precise, long-range strikes from concealed positions on the high cliffs. TOW teams targeted command vehicles, lead tanks, and recovery vehicles, creating chaos and paralyzing advances. The offensive, despite immense Soviet firepower, failed to eliminate Massoud's forces. The TOW had helped turn the Panjshir into an armored graveyard and a strategic stalemate. The effect was equally devastating on the sprawling Logar Highway, a crucial supply route south of Kabul. Here, commanders like Abdul Haq orchestrated ambushes of surgical precision. A favorite tactic was to use a first tow to destroy the lead armored vehicle of a convoy, and a second to destroy the rearguard, trapping the soft-skinned trucks and fuel tankers in between. This head and tail method then allowed fighters with RPGs and machine guns to devastate the immobilized column. Soviet logistics, entirely dependent on these vulnerable roads, began to hemorrhage equipment. Repair and recovery operations themselves became high-risk endeavors, as the tow teams often waited for the tow trucks and engineering vehicles to arrive before engaging them as well. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging engagements occurred in the flatlands around Jalalabad and the Bugram Air Base perimeter. In these more open areas, Soviet tankers had felt a semblance of security, believing they could see threats at a distance. The TOW shattered that illusion. Teams would dig spider holes, or use abandoned compounds, engaging tanks from ranges that appeared safe. A grim ritual developed. A tank would be hit, and a second would maneuver to shield the stricken vehicle, only to present its own side armor to another tow team positioned on a different azimuth. The Soviets dubbed these unseen killers spiders, for their hidden, patient and fatal bites. The statistical spike was undeniable. Where earlier Soviet armored vehicle losses were attributed to mines or close assault RPGs, after 1984, an increasing percentage were recorded with the terse, devastating notation, hit by an anti-tank guided missile. Debriefings of shaken survivors consistently described the same sequence. A sudden impact from an unseen direction, no preceding small arms fire, and the utter impossibility of retaliation. The weapon was rewriting the after-action reports of the 40th Army. This systemic success forced a crisis within the Soviet military command in Kabul and Moscow. They could no longer dismiss the TOW as a lucky shot or a captured novelty. It was a clear and present technological threat that was crippling their operational mobility and eroding the morale of their premier fighting vehicles. A response was not just necessary, it was a matter of survival for the armored forces' very relevance in the conflict. The initiative had passed for the first time from the Soviet armored fist to the guerrilla with the guidance sight. The Soviet High Command was now compelled to react, to adapt, and to counter a threat for which their entire doctrine had never prepared them. The Soviet response to the TOW threat was a multi-layered campaign of adaptation, reflecting both the ingenuity and the profound constraints of a military bureaucracy fighting a distant, draining war. It unfolded not as a single triumphant counterstroke, but as a desperate, costly, and only partially effective scramble to regain the initiative. The first and most immediate reaction was tactical. New, grimly pragmatic standing orders filtered down to armored units. Road movement was fundamentally altered. Tanks now advanced in short, bounding spurts, using whatever cover existed, a rare grove of trees, a fold in the terrain, as temporary hull-down positions. The lead vehicle in a column became a sacrificial role, often given to an older T-55 or even an armored recovery vehicle. Reconnaissance by fire became standard, saturating suspected ridge lines and compounds with machine gun and main gun fire before moving, a wasteful but psychologically necessary tactic to suppress potential tow teams. Convoy intervals between vehicles were dramatically increased to prevent a single ambush from trapping the entire column, slowing movement to a crawl and stretching command and control. Air support was tightly integrated. No major armored movement proceeded without pre-planned artillery strikes on known ambush points and the constant overhead presence of Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships. The Hind's role evolved to include TOW hunting, using its rockets and cannon to scour firing positions. However, the TOW's engagement range often placed the launch site beyond the effective range of the Hind's weapons, and the helicopter's own vulnerability to Mujahideen heavy machine guns and later, Stinger missiles, made prolonged loitering risky. Technologically, the Soviets rushed to field countermeasures. The most direct was the development and deployment of explosive reactive armor, ERA. Boxes of ERA, specifically the One Contact One system, began appearing on Soviet tanks in Afghanistan by late 1985-86. When struck by a shape-charged jet, the ERA brick would detonate outward, disrupting the jet's focus and significantly reducing its penetration. This was a genuine breakthrough. Initial after-action reports indicated that some TOW strikes on ERA-equipped tanks resulted in only minor damage, a burst of relief and renewed confidence for the crews. But the adaptation was met with counter-adaptation. The CIA and ISI, monitoring the battlefield through after-action intelligence, responded by supplying the newer TOW-2 missiles. The TOW-2 featured a tandem warhead. A small precursor charge would detonate the ERA, clearing a path for the main warhead to strike the now unprotected base armor. The technological race escalated, but the Mujahideen, with an endless external supply, remained one step ahead. The Soviets also experimented with Shtora-1 soft-kill systems, infrared jammers designed to blind the missile's tracker. But these complex systems were never deployed in significant numbers in Afghanistan. The war ended before they could become operational. The most telling limitation, however, was not technological but logistical and moral. These countermeasures, reactive armor, intensified air support, new tactics, required resources, training, and time. They were applied piecemeal, first to elite units and critical fronts. The average motorized rifle regiment, grinding out its tour in a remote province, still faced the toe with largely unmodified tactics and unprotected tanks. Furthermore, the psychological damage was indelible. No slab of ERA could erase the memory of a missile guiding itself to its target. Tactical paranoia became endemic. A veteran Soviet officer later noted, "The TOW didn't just destroy tanks, it destroyed our peace of mind. Every hill became a threat, every patrol a potential funeral." By 1986, a grim equilibrium had been reached. The Soviets had learned to respect the TOW's reach, making their operations more cautious, more expensive in terms of resources and time, and less effective. The Mujahideen, while no longer achieving the shockingly one-sided kills of 1984–85, could still dictate the terms of engagement, channeling Soviet movements and inflicting steady, demoralizing losses. The TOW had successfully done what its CIA proponents had intended. It had broken the Soviet armored offensive spirit. It turned the initiative from a Soviet prerogative into a contested, costly struggle. The tank was no longer the master of the battlefield. It was a vulnerable unit requiring constant protection. This shift in momentum was irreversible and paved the way for the final, weary act of the conflict. The relentless attrition and strategic paralysis caused by weapons like the TOW set the stage for the war's grim conclusion, a finale not of a decisive battle, but of exhaustion and withdrawal. The legacy of the TOW missile in the Soviet-Afghan War is etched in cold statistics and in the scarred memories of the men who faced it. Quantifying its exact toll is complex. Soviet archives were often opaque and Mujahideen claims were subject to inflation, but the directional shift is undeniable. Prior to 1984, Soviet armored vehicle losses, while significant, were attributed largely to mines, RPGs in close assault and mechanical failure. From mid-1984 onward, after-action reports from the 40th Army show a sharp and persistent increase in losses categorized to anti-tank guided missiles. Western intelligence estimates, corroborated by post-war Soviet analyses, suggest that ATGMs, predominantly TOWs, were responsible for destroying or disabling several hundred Soviet tanks and armored fighting vehicles between 1984 and 1989. In certain key sectors like the Panjshir and along the Logar Highway, the percentage of tank losses to TOWs approached 50 to 60% during peak periods. But numbers alone cannot capture the phenomenon the Soviets came to call TOW terror. This was a pervasive, corrosive anxiety that rewired the operational mindset of the armored force. The psychologist's term learned helplessness found a brutal application on the roads of Afghanistan. Tank commanders, once trained to seize ground aggressively, now hesitated. Drivers, instructed to move swiftly between cover, would freeze in open ground, paralyzed by the sight of a distant ridge. The constant, high-alert scanning for a barely visible launch flash or a thin smoke trail led to combat fatigue at an accelerated rate. The weapon imposed a profound sense of vulnerability. Inside their 40-ton steel shells, crews felt exposed, watched, and pre-targeted. This terror had tangible tactical consequences. Operational tempo slowed to a crawl. Movements that should have taken hours now took days, as every potential firing position had to be reconnoitered, pre-fired upon, or avoided. Initiative was suppressed. Junior officers, fearing catastrophic losses from an unseen TOW team, became reluctant to deviate from approved routes or to pursue retreating Mujahideen into terrain that favored long-range ambush. Resource allocation was skewed. An ever greater share of artillery and air support had to be dedicated simply to allowing armor to move, stripping those resources from offensive operations elsewhere. The TOW, in effect, acted as a force multiplier for the Mujahideen by forcing the Soviets to expend disproportionate resources to mitigate its threat. The impact on crew morale and retention was severe. The armored forces, a prestigious branch in the Soviet military, began to hemorrhage experienced personnel. Conscript tankers lived with a ticking clock of dread for their entire 2-year tour. Officers saw command of a tank company not as a career-enhancing step, but as a high-probability ticket to a maiming or a posthumous award. The quality of manpower in armored units suffered, which in turn reduced tactical proficiency and exacerbated losses. Veterans' memoirs are littered with references to the TOW as a unique horror, distinct from the generalized dangers of war. It represented an impersonal, technologically sanctioned death that they could not answer in kind. This psychological and tactical erosion did not occur in a vacuum. It synergized with other CIA-supplied weapons, most notably the FIM-92 Stinger missile introduced in late 1986. The Stinger contested Soviet air dominance, making the Heinz and Su-25s that protected armored columns themselves vulnerable. The combined effect of TOW and Stinger created a lethal dilemma for Soviet commanders: move armored columns and risk TOW ambushes, or rely on air assault and risk Stinger engagements. Both pillars of their combined arms doctrine, armor and close air support, were now under severe technologically advanced threat. The battlefield had become comprehensively hostile. The TOW terror was not a myth, it was a measurable degradation of Soviet combat power. It transformed the tank from an instrument of decision into a vulnerable liability, a symbol not of invincibility, but of a superpower's technological overreach and strategic fatigue. The consequences of this degradation would extend far beyond the mountains, shaping the political decision to withdraw and casting a long shadow over the future of Soviet military prestige. The strategic consequences of the TOW's success reverberated from the Hindu Kush to the corridors of the Kremlin. While no single weapon wins a war, the TOW missile became a critical symbol and catalyst in a cascade of failures that forced a fundamental Soviet strategic reassessment. By making the cost of holding territory and maintaining supply lines prohibitively expensive in blood and material, it directly contributed to the political calculus that led to withdrawal. The political leadership in Moscow, first under Konstantin Chernenko and then decisively under Mikhail Gorbachev, was receiving increasingly grim reports from Afghanistan. The war was a bleeding ulcer, costing billions of rubles annually and staining the USSR's international reputation. The rise of killer technology like the TOW and Stinger provided the military with a concrete, tactical explanation for the stalemate that even party ideologues could understand. It was no longer just about counter-revolutionary bands. It was about the full, covert might of the United States equipping the Mujahideen with weapons that neutralized Soviet technical superiority. General Secretary Gorbachev, seeking perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, at home, could not justify an endless, escalating technological arms race in a distant, unwinnable war. The TOW helped demonstrate that winning would require a level of commitment and escalation, potentially including direct conflict with the U.S., that the Politburo was no longer willing to entertain. The decision to withdraw, announced in April 1988 and completed in February 1989, was the ultimate strategic consequence. The TOW's role was enshrined in the bitter lessons learned by the Soviet military. Post-war analyses like those conducted by General Major Ret. Alexander Lyakovsky explicitly cited the game-changing impact of advanced Western ATGMs and manpads. The war had exposed catastrophic vulnerabilities in Soviet equipment and tactics when faced with a technologically sophisticated proxy. This lesson would fuel a frantic, but ultimately bankrupting, modernization push in the final years of the USSR. For the Mujahideen and the CIA-ISI alliance, the TOW was a triumphant validation. It proved that a technologically inferior guerrilla force, when equipped with precise, standoff weapons, could negate a superpower's principal advantages. The pipeline that delivered the TOW became the blueprint for future covert arms transfers. The weapon itself took on a mythic status within the resistance. To possess a TOW launcher was a mark of prestige and trust from their foreign sponsors. This very success, however, sowed seeds for future conflict. The networks of distribution and patronage established by the ISI to control the TOW flow empowered certain factions, like Haqqani and Hekmatyar, over others, shaping the brutal civil war that followed the Soviet withdrawal and contributing to the rise of a new, even more radical force, the Taliban. The global legacy of the TOW in Afghanistan was profound. It marked the first widespread, successful use of advanced ATGMs in a guerrilla war, a lesson meticulously studied by militaries and non-state actors worldwide. It demonstrated that the anti-tank battle was no longer confined to close ranges and brute force, but had evolved into a long-range, precision duel. Every modern insurgent group, from Hezbollah to Syrian rebels, has since sought to acquire and employ advanced ATGMs, understanding the psychological and tactical paralysis they can induce in conventional armored forces. The TOW shot became a staple of insurgent propaganda video, a direct descendant of those first grainy films shot by Mujahideen in the Panjshir. Finally, for Soviet tankers who survived, the aftermath was a lifelong burden. They returned to a collapsing country that had little interest in their trauma. The specific, wire-guided horror of the TOW haunted them, a memory of helplessness that stood apart from other combat experiences. Their war had been one where the very symbol of their nation's military power, the tank, had been rendered obsolescent by a device guided by a man in sandals via a hair-thin wire. It was a humiliating epitaph for a superpower's military adventure. The echoes of those impacts, the shattered confidence, the shifted strategies, the blueprints for future conflicts, did not fade with the last Soviet convoy crossing the Friendship Bridge. They became a permanent feature of modern warfare's landscape. The story of the TOW missile in Afghanistan is not merely a tale of a weapon's effectiveness. It is a parable about the displacement of power in the late 20th century. On one level, it is a stark lesson in technological asymmetry, how a system designed for the European plains could redefine a mountain guerrilla war, transferring decisive advantage from the operator of a tank to the operator of a site. The wire that guided the missile also connected the desperate fight in a remote valley to the strategic calculations in Washington and Moscow, making the Afghan battlefield a direct conduit for superpower rivalry. But at its core, this history is about the human experience within that technological shift. For the Soviet tanker, it was the chilling realization that his armor was no longer a shield, but a predestined tomb. For the Mujahideen gunner, it was the transformative power of being able to strike with certainty from a place of relative safety. The TOW redefined courage and vulnerability. It replaced the close-range gamble of the RPG with the distant, patient calculation of a sniper. It turned the emotional anchor of the war from the heat of close combat to the cold, waiting tension before a launch, and the silent, tracking flight that followed. The conflict proved that a single piece of technology could fracture an entire doctrine. Soviet combined arms theory, built around the armored fist, was blunted and made hesitant. The tank, that quintessential symbol of industrial-age warfare, was forced to cede dominance to a precision-guided weapon system that heralded the information age. This was not the end of the tank, but the beginning of its eternal new challenge, to evolve against ever smarter, ever longer-reaching threats that could be carried by a single soldier. Ultimately, the TOW's wire symbolizes a deeper truth. In war, the connection between cause and effect, between action and consequence, can be stretched thin, almost invisible, but it is never truly broken. The decisions made in Langley laboratories and Kremlin chambers manifested as fire and metal in the Hindu Kush. The shock felt by a young tanker in his final seconds reverberated back to topple political certitudes. The war in Afghanistan showed that in the modern era victory and defeat are seldom absolute, but the tools of conflict, like the wire-guided missile, possess a terrible clarity. They are conduits of political will and of historical force, connecting the grand to the granular in a flash of irrevocable change. The valleys fell silent, the wires decayed. But the lesson remained, etched into the hillsides and the memory of war, that against the weight of armor, the slenderest of threads, guided by a determined eye, could prove to be the strongest force of all.